Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with two wonderful guests, Scott McGill and Susannah Wright. They are the new English translators of the Aeneid. Scott is professor in the Humanities at Rice University. His work mostly focuses on Latin poetry, Roman history and culture, reception of classical antiquity. He's an expert on Virgil and Latin poetry of late antiquity. Susannah is assistant professor of classical studies and Roman history at Rice University as well, and her research centers on Greco-Roman literature, history and culture, as well as Latin and Greek epic texts of all periods, women and gender in antiquity, politics and literature in late Republican imperial Rome, and ancient medieval histories of the Trojan War. And as I mentioned, they are the co-translators of the new English translation of the Aeneid, which is what we talk about. I was very happy to have both of them on. I always love to have, as if I can, both authors or translators. It's always very, very nice to hear the dynamics, and you can certainly hear their wonderful dynamics, which gives it a lot of kind of importance to understand, like when one is reading this new wonderful translation of the Aeneid, kind of to really see that this was a partnership, and so they have a great partnership. We of course talk about past English translations of the Aeneid, talk about the plot in comparison with Homer's epics. We discuss the authorship of Virgil. Was the Aeneid Roman propaganda? Translating from Latin into English and the oral versus written tradition. We talk about different types of meter and the one that they used, relationship between humans and gods, why the Aeneid is still relevant for us now in the 21st century, and many other topics. Again, really such a delight talking with Scott and Susannah, wonderful people, brilliant, and they've done just a tremendous work in translating. For me, in my mind, the new standard English translation for the Aeneid. It's very good. I really enjoyed rereading it, and it's just they absolutely crushed it. They did a great job in their translation, and I would highly recommend folks getting out there and picking it up. Of course, you can find this conversation and all the conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so get over there. Please subscribe. Following is cool, but subscribing is even better. You get in your inbox. You get when the episodes are immediately posted. I'm on a weekly basis at the moment, but we might pick it up a little bit in the fall. We'll see. Get to a week again. We'll see. So now I bring you Scott McGill and Susannah Wright. I am here with two wonderful guests, Scott McGill and Susannah Wright. Very happy to have both of them here on the podcast. Scott, Susannah, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. You guys have done just a wonderful job on a new English translation of the Aeneid, which is out through Live Right. It's really good. We're gonna talk all about it. So before we do, why don't you tell listeners kind of just who you are professionally, academically, any relevant details, and then we'll get into it. When I do these, I always when I have 2 or 3 or 4 guests or however many, I just go in order by last name. So nobody get mad at me if I do it any other way. So Scott, you have M. So Scott, go first. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a professor of classical studies at Rice University in Houston. I focus mainly on Latin poetry, and especially, as you might imagine, Virgil. And I'm also interested in the kind of Roman literary history and the classical tradition.
Nice. Susannah, what about you?
Yes. So I am also at Rice University, a professor of classical studies and Roman history. And my research centers on the epic tradition from antiquity to the Middle Ages in both Latin and Greek. And some special interests include the long afterlives of the Trojan War, and then also representations of grief in epic and the ways in which they relate to wider
Very nice.
cultural practices and expectations about acceptable mourning.
Very, very interesting. That's very interesting. So how did this come about? Did I think Liv writes through Norton? So did they come to you both and say, do this translation, or did one of you have the idea, or how did you guys kind of come to do this? And just tell us briefly what your sort of process was of how to were you sharing I'm going to take these lines and you take these lines, or what was the process doing two? I've talked to people that have translated by themselves, but for the two of you as a duo, how did you guys kind of divide and conquer?
Yeah, so the origin story of this translation is actually a bit of an interesting one. I was a Scott's student when I was an undergraduate at Rice, and so my senior year, I was beginning to work on kind of a senior thesis project that had to do with heroic deaths in epic poetry, kind of in some ways prefiguring my later interests in grief, although I didn't know it then. So in the course of that project, we wound up working on a verse translation of the amazing scene, the death of Priam in Aeneid 2. And from there, we were just really, we enjoyed that so much. So should we maybe look at translating the rest of Aeneid 2? Yeah, okay, let's do that. And then it was kind of a, all downhill from there. Basically, we went from there to, thinking that, well, maybe it would make sense to try our hand at the rest of the poem. So it really was kind of an organic outgrowth of that process. In many ways, I think we probably wouldn't have had the audacity to try our hand at the whole thing right off the bat. So we kind of eased our way in that way. Yeah.
You did one book and you said, well, let's just do the other 11. We're already, we're 12th of the way there. So yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then we worked on it from about 2018 until last year.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah, so we approached ourselves. We approached Norton and Liv Wright in 2018. Gotten an initial contract, and then Susannah was in graduate school, so she was balancing those responsibilities with translating. But at first we were translating each of us individual books, and then we would share them via email. But we discovered that it was exhausting our track changes function to try to go back and forth with our comments. And our voices just weren't blending in the way that we had hoped they would. So we realized and decided that we had to work together on every single line of the poem. So we literally began book 1, line 1, either via video conference or in person, and work through the entire poem together in real time.
That's cool. That's cool. Yeah. That I mean, for years, that has to be such a fun experience. I don't know if I've done anything even close to something like that. That has to be such a nice kind of way of connecting, and then it's like, it's not only just like, oh, we did this for 6-7 years together and we have some Zoom calls, but like you have it not only out there and everyone else to enjoy your hard work too. So that has to be very rewarding. Very rewarding.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Yes.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful experience. Yeah.
We joke.
So go ahead.
We joke that it was effectively the product of over 100,000 collaborative decisions, because it roughly a 10,000 line poem and an average of 10 beats a line. So, over time that does really add up, but it was really gratifying, definitely, to get to work through it together in that way. And also just to live with Virgil and to engage with the poem so deeply for so long. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine. That has to be such a unique experience. Now, just one quick thing here. And I'm not. You both will probably know this more than I will, of course. But how many, I guess, generally translate? So it's originally in Latin, and it's in Latin, I guess, for a while. It was written, not oral. So how was how it was Latin for X amount of years, and then when did it start getting translated in other languages? When did we first see it in English? And I guess, what's the most recent one? So before this came out, what was the one I would have access to if I'm on Amazon or something like that? Or I want to read the Aeneid in English. What was the last translation to be done? So yeah, tell us what's just a brief snapshot of the translation of the Aeneid in Latin and then other language, including English.
Yeah, I would say the last one you would have access to was only from about 4 years ago, and that's Shadi Barch's translation. There have been others as well. Sarah Rudin has a very nice translation from 2008, is the first edition. The one that probably people are most familiar with is Robert Fagel's.
Yeah.
From the early 2000s.
I think that's the one. That's the one I've read initially.
Yeah. There's Fitzgerald as well from the 80s, Mandelbaum from the 70s. So there's no shortage of translations of the Aeneid. We've now added our voice to that chorus. The poem, it goes back a long way in English. It's the Earl of Surrey. Correct me if I'm wrong, Susannah, but it's the Earl of Surrey who first translated it in. Did you know the date?
Basically 16th century, like around 1540 or so, I think.
Yeah, 1540. I think that's right. Wow. He translated the two books of the Aeneid, and he translated the poem into blank verse. He was the first one to use blank verse in English. So, yeah, it's always been a classic. It was a classic from the moment it was published in 19 BC. Never out of print. No matter whatever that means when you're dealing with a time before the printing press, but it was always being copied, always being read, and always been a kind of a staple of literary culture and school curricula.
How does it feel for the both of you then if it's been translated heavily, you're talking, plus or minus, I guess, 500 years in English, and it's been around for 2,000 years or 2,000 plus years total. I mean, what was it, I guess, generally, we'll talk more about this in specifics, but I just wanted to flag it here. Generally, what were you both trying to add in terms of your translation of like kind of your voice there into the kind of, sort of canon of the translation of the Aeneid? What were you trying to kind of, at least aspirationally, kind of place your mark there?
Yeah, I would say there are a couple of things that we were really striving to capture. One is that we wanted to achieve kind of a middle path between accessibility and elevation for the reader. So it is an epic text. We didn't want to make it feel kind of unduly modern, and for that reason we avoid the use of things like contractions, but we also think that it's important for the urgency and the immediacy of the poetry to really come through. One ancient description of Virgil's poetry that's linked to Agrippa, the son-in-law and close associate of Augustus, is the idea that Virgil's poetry was neither bombastic nor plain, that it kind of struck this middle ground. So one of our goals was to really capture that while also doing justice just to the emotional weight and the really profound pathos of this poem.
Yeah, that's nice.
I'd say too that we took great care with the length of the translation, and we did that because we're concerned with the pace of the narrative. So I won't get too deep in the weeds here now, but we did translate the poem into blank verse. Blank verse, and the original is in dactylic hexameter. Dactylic hexameter has 6 metrical feet, so the kind of units into which a poetic line is divided. Dactylic hexameter has 6 of them. Pentameter has 5 of them. So each line of our translation is 1 foot shorter than the original. So we felt that if we translated line by line, as other translators have done, we were in fact shortening the poem, and we were shortening the poem by a 1/6, right? If you cut one foot from each line. So we decided every 5 lines to give ourselves 1 extra line to make up for the 5 feet that we had lost. I said I wasn't going to get too deep into the weeds, but I think I am. But at any rate, the idea was to produce a foot by foot translation rather than a line by line translation, to try to match the number of metrical feet in the original rather than matching the number of lines. And again, our overall goal there is to try to preserve the sense of pace.
Yeah. And I'll just add too, relative to blank verse or unrhymed iambic pentameter, as Scott's just described, that meter does have a long history, not just in relation to translations of the Aeneid, but as a meter associated with epic in the English tradition. So we did feel that it was, for our translation, the appropriate choice as a way of capturing the poetic quality of the original. That we're not using the same meter as Virgil used, but one that occupies kind of a comparable place in its tradition, because dactylic hexameter was always in antiquity the meter of epic. This is the meter of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid. In English, iambic pentameter is also associated with things like Milton's Paradise Lost, and so on. So we wanted to kind of capture a cultural equivalent to that kind of epic quality.
Yeah, I'll definitely ask about that in a bit. I will say here that a lot of the times people forget, I mean, I have at different points too, that we talk about how these are big epics, but they're poems. And so poems have a certain way of functioning. And so what you guys are describing here is very important for how it should be read and how it should be and how it would, somewhat closeness to how it was for a while. And so I deeply respect that commitment to doing that. So I'll ask a few more about that later. But I think the idea of making sure that it stays as poetry, even if it is epic in nature, I think is probably most essential here. So the Aeneid, I mean, if you're in I don't know, a high school and you haven't read this yet or something, or someone that somehow has never heard of it or never read it, I mean, what is this? I mean, what is it about? And all these places and names and events and themes, and there's all these things going on. But yeah, so what is it generally about? You can talk about general themes if you want. And I guess this is sort of I'll probably ask this at some point towards the end, but why do we care still about something written 2,000 plus years ago? I mean, isn't this just like an old story for people at the time? Like, what is the kind of everlasting, if you will, or the piece that it stands the test of time and all of these things? Yeah. So tell us about the themes and why it's still relevant.
Sure. So maybe I'll just start with a brief overview of the plot. Aeneas is a Trojan fighting in the Trojan War, so the Greeks versus the Trojans. The Greeks overcome the Trojans and, in fact, destroy the city of Troy using the trick of the Trojan horse, and we find that in the Aeneid. So, with the city razed, with the city destroyed, Aeneas gathers a band of Trojan refugees, those survivors from that horrible defeat, and they make their way westward. So from Troy, which is in today's Turkey, they are making their way ultimately to Italy. They know that their fated destiny is to arrive in Italy. It is the case that despite being fated, it's not easy. It is not an easy journey from the remains, the kind of smoking ruins of Troy to Italy. So much of the first half of the poem traces their journey from Troy to Italy with stops along the way, including a stop in Carthage where they encounter the Queen Dido, and Aeneas embarks on a dramatic affair with her. When they arrive in Italy, they meet the native population. At first, Latinus, a local king, is willing to welcome the Trojans and to forge an alliance with them. But his efforts are frustrated by the goddess Juno. A war ensues. The war occupies much of the second half of the poem. And the poem ends, and we can talk more about this, in a very kind of arresting and I think surprising way, with the death of Aeneas's major adversary, Turnus. Aeneas killing him. The final shot of the poem is Aeneas killing Turnus with no further resolution. Right, so it feels like a somewhat abrupt ending. But at that point, the Trojans are in fact in Italy, and that's where they will stay. Ultimately, the Trojans will become the Romans. So the ancestors of the Romans are these Trojan people. A forefather is Aeneas.
Susannah, what do you want to add something here?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll speak maybe a little bit to why this poem maintains such enduring relevance and why we should still care about it today. I think one of the big reasons is just it's a really compelling story. I think you can hear, in the summary that Scott just gave, right? We have epic battle scenes, we have adventures at sea, we have uncertain destinies, doomed love affairs, betrayal. There's a journey to the underworld. Gotta love a good epic journey to the underworld. There's so many elements in this story that have the ability to just really captivate readers. And they're also all presented in a way that is just profoundly humane on the deepest level. Virgil writes the Aeneid in a way that reflects kind of deep sympathy, not just for the Trojans as the predecessors of the Romans, but also for the people who oppose the destiny of the Trojans to journey across the sea and make it to Italy. The people who resist and who are victims of that move toward the Roman future are also treated with really, really deep sympathy. Chief among them, Dido, but there are also a number of characters that we can speak to in the latter half of the poem who exemplify that as well. So I think it raises in that way really important questions about everything from, how to keep going when everything seems lost, how to balance kind of living for yourself and living for others, to also things like, what happens when one group of people believes that they have a destiny that leads them to a land where others already live, things along those lines. There are a lot of, even though this is a very ancient text, there's a lot in it that we can still kind of really dig into today, and that can kind of move us, I think, similarly to expand our sympathies and kind of think more widely than these potentially narrow categories.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, in rereading it, I was reminded, it's been a while since I read it, so reading it, I was aside from really being very thankful for the wonderful English translation, I was also thinking about the themes here that were coming out, which were, again, themes of loss and labor and passion and dispossession and, duty is a big thing. We'll talk about that maybe. But yeah, there's a lot of big themes that are there. I guess the two questions here is, I guess, the historicity of the story, the Trojan War and the whole thing. I mean, I think people have debated this and still debate it. Where is the epic begin and end, and where does history begin and end with the Aeneid? But then also, it does seem to live in the shadow of Homer's epics, the Iliad primarily, but also elements of the Odyssey as well. How does it, is this just, the kind of Roman propaganda and the Iliad and Odyssey, or the Greek propaganda? Like, what is the, I guess, how does something, when Virgil's writing this, I mean, obviously that maybe he was or wasn't aware of Homer's, epics, but I mean, how do you not have that as a comparison point, right? I mean, it feels like, I don't know, I'm sure you can take some film director or some band or something where they're like just riffing off of, somebody, great before them. I mean, how does it stand on its own? Obviously it's talking about, especially in the Iliad, similar events that happen, of course, different perspective, and it's a different story. But yeah, how do we understand it juxtaposed with Homer's epics as well?
Yeah, I'll say first that Virgil was absolutely, utterly, keenly aware of Homer. And he advertises that with the very first two words of the poem. The very first two words are arma virum, arms and a man. The word arma refers back to the very first word of the Iliad, which is mainen, which means wrath. So it's the idea of violence, military violence in particular, right? And then the second, the arma, the virum corresponds to andra, which is the very first word of the Odyssey, right? So through the very first two words of the poem, he signals, I'm going to combine the Iliad and the Odyssey into one poem. Now, Homer needed 48 books with the two poems together. Virgil does it in 12, so it's a kind of masterpiece of compression. But yeah, so I'll say too that the ancient notion of originality was defined by working within a tradition and doing new things with that tradition. So there was nothing plagiaristic about Virgil modeling his poems so closely on Homer. The key was making something new of Homer. He does so. Now, again, he organizes it. The first half of the poem is organized roughly on the Odyssey. The second half of the poem organized roughly on the Iliad. And again, he advertises this even explicitly at different points in the poem. But the key was the key thing for Virgil is to renew the themes of Homer, to take Homer in new directions, new Roman directions, new literary directions. So it's that was the kind of force of originality in this.
Was
right?
it was it intended for this type of story for this audience in this time period? So this is for the Roman Empire, or soon to be empire, and this is our kind of brand of this story. You can read Homer and you can read those epics, but here's kind of our stance on it. Is it something like this?
Very much so. Yeah, I would say Virgil is really conscious of the fact that he's producing an equivalent to the Homeric poems for the Roman context of his own day. He's writing in the 20s BCE as the consolidation of power under Augustus is taking place. This is a rise of a new regime, and so it is, a moment in which this kind of epic of origins makes a lot of sense, looking back to the past by way of kind of making statements about who the Romans will be moving forward in the future. But he's also, Virgil, he's engaging deeply with Homer in the ways that Scott described. And I'm glad you raised that question, actually, because there are, I would say, probably two big misconceptions that hold readers back from really getting excited about the Aeneid and digging into it. One is that it's a sort of flat propaganda piece. One is that it's a sort of flat Homeric fan fiction piece. We think it's really neither of those things. But one of the ways that Virgil reshapes Homer is by crafting a hero who, on some level, has attributes of Odysseus and Achilles, the great Homeric heroes. He suffers through a long journey. He endures. He pushes past significant obstacles on land and sea in the way that Odysseus does. He also, like Achilles, excels on the battlefield, sometimes gets swept up by wrath, at times refuses mercy to people who beg him for it. He looks at moments a lot like both of those heroes, but at the same time, he embodies instead a new kind of Roman ideal, which we call pietas in Latin. It's the sense of duty that's kind of an all-embracing sense of duty toward family, toward countrymen, it can be toward destiny, toward the gods. But all those layers come together into a kind of portrait of a new hero for the Roman present. And simultaneously, that virtue of pietas was one that Augustus was really emphasizing in his own cultural program. So I think we can see in that the ways in which all these threads are kind of coming together.
Yeah, I'll just say too, just to add to that very quickly, the Homeric hero is driven by a need for kleos, which means fame, and it's personal fame, personal glory, having your name live on, having your glorious exploits remembered. This new kind of hero that Virgil crafts in Aeneas is concerned about history, about his responsibility to others, about his responsibility to his community, but truly his responsibility to destiny, right? To lead these Trojans to Italy so that ultimately the Romans can arise. So it's a really different conception of what heroism is, and modeled on Homer, but very much transforming Homer too. And again, Virgil's initial audience there's a contemporary poet named Propertius who says, while the Aeneid's being written, he says something greater than the Iliad is being born. Right, so there was always the sense that this poem was going to kind of rival Homer's, but again, in this very, very new way, with a very different version of and vision of epic heroism.
It's very fascinating. Both of you explained that very well, so I'm glad that you explain it that way. I'm just thinking about the journey of it, and yeah, I mean, Troy is in the Aegean. It's in western Turkey, sort of on the north side of the Aegean, actually, on the northwest side of Turkey, modern day Turkey. And yeah, you have to go across the beautiful Aegean Sea. It's very beautiful, and go through all the Greek isles and stuff. Go on the southern part of Greece, and then you get to the Ionian Sea, and then you're there into Italy. That's a long journey. Like that would be like if you were to try to do that by boat today or ship or whatever, it would be long. Like back then, it had to be like taking months. Like it is. I mean, gorgeous. I mean, that part of the world is gorgeous, but Yeah, just so it's interesting to think about like a journey, and even by that time would be long and arduous and all these things, and then it obviously today would still be be a lot. So it's just very, very interesting. Tell us about Virgil, just briefly about the authorship question is always fascinating to me. So I think that there is maybe because it's older, it's ancient Greek and stuff, but some people all have pondered if Homer was a real person. Was it a bunch of different people? Was it a kind of amalgamation of things? I'll give you the I'm sure maybe you both know this, but I had a conversation with Robert and Lane Fox on the podcast a couple of years ago. I don't remember, maybe it was last year. And he was like, yeah, he was a real person and he was illiterate. He was like, I don't think he knew how to speak or to read and write. And hence, this was written down by people later, but it was oral tradition, things like that. So we'll come to that in a minute, but not the case. It doesn't seem with Virgil. Obviously very much a real person. And so do you think, some people have different ideas about this in terms of translation and even with more modern texts, but how important is it to know as much as we can the nature, the psychology, or the makeup, or the temperament, or the motivations of Virgil and what he was up to? Or do we just read the text and say, yeah, this is what it is, and we make of it what we will? What's the I guess the elements here of authorship that are most salient?
Yeah, I'll say first that we're on firm ground with Virgil. Happily, we know he existed. There are contemporary poets who refer to him, so his identity is not at all in question. I think it is important to know that he lived in the first century BC, and he lived. And he wrote the Aeneid while Augustus was consolidating powers. So I think it's really important to know that, because in some ways the Aeneid does serve as a national epic. It's a story of Rome's origins, right? And it's to some degree, and we can talk more about this. To some degree, it is a celebration of the destined kind of greatness of Rome. So to know that he's writing this. Under a new leader, and in connection with that new leader, I think is really, really important, right? In other ways, we don't know much about Virgil. There is an ancient biographical tradition that does provide some information, but a lot of that information is unreliable because it's just extracted from his poetry. Right, so it's just taking the things that he writes and then attributing them to the life of the poet. It has some intriguing pieces of information. For example, Virgil only wrote 3 lines a day. He was this incredibly exacting poet. So that's an interesting detail. There's of course the detail that he died before he could put the final touches on the Aeneid, and that's intriguing as well. We don't know how true these details are. So we can, there's no way of confirming them. I will say that a kind of authorial personality comes out in the poem. We can't know what Virgil himself was like. It's simply impossible. But a voice is very, very present in the Aeneid. A voice of sympathy, of human sympathy and human pity, of pathos. So you feel like you have a sense of who this author is, no matter what he was like biographically. There is this notion of this deeply sensitive and sympathetic author, right, extending great pity to his various characters.
Susanna?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think it's definitely one of the standing challenges of approaching this poem is determining, to what extent to try to read Virgil's own identity and life experiences into the text itself. We tried as much as we could as translators, even though we did feel that we developed kind of a sort of a kinship with him along the way in the experience of likewise, living with this text and spending, usually we managed, a bit more than 3 lines a day, but kind of, we tried to hold ourselves to an exacting standard as well. So we felt a sympathy with the poet in that way. At the same time, we also felt it was important to kind of leave some of the open-ended questions that Virgil presents the reader similarly open-ended in our translation. So, the extent to which to read Virgil as kind of a subversive political actor critiquing Augustus's regime versus a kind of an enthusiastic proponent of the Roman future. This is one of the great kind of interpretive issues of the poem. And we do see in it a voice, certainly a strong voice that, as Scott said, speaks to the costs of, the rise of the Roman future. But we also wanted to sort of stick as closely to the text as we could, and to leave some of those pathways open to our readers as well, to not kind of foreclose interpretive possibilities that are opened by the poem regarding some of those really big questions.
I mean, since you brought it up, Scott, let me just ask it here to connect it here. How this kind of like origins of Rome kind of thing is interesting. I mean, Augustus is one of the first, right, or the first Roman Empire or emperor. What is the how involved was Augustus in spreading the use of the poem? I mean, again, I don't think it's quite propaganda, but maybe there's a twinge of it a little bit there for Rome of sorts. But what does it tell us, anything about the Roman Republic to then empire, which we see in that period? And then, there's obviously impact on Dante's Divine Comedy and other works. But yeah, how much was Augustus involved in this trying to form republic and then later empire? What was the kind of how was this used as a kind of vehicle to kind of spread certain things about origin or nationalism or sense of identity or things like that with the poem? How is that too much overstating it, or am I understating it? What's the story here?
Well, again, it was definitely the kind of central poem in the Latin literary tradition from the time it was published. I mean, it was an instant classic. It was an instant school text. It was widely read. The extent to which Augustus is responsible for that is very, very unclear. Again, the biographical tradition tells us that Virgil wanted to burn his poem, right, when he knew he was dying. That he wanted to destroy it. One of Virgil's friends named Varius make sure that doesn't happen, and then Augustus worked with Varius to have this figure, to have Varius edit it and put it out to publish it, to circulate it. Again, we can't know if that's true or not. I will say that you're right that there are moments that feel propagandistic. Moment in Book 8, for example, a kind of celebration of the Battle of Actium, which was a major victory for Augustus in 31 BC. So there are certainly those moments, but because Virgil focuses so much on human sympathy, and sympathy that he extends to figures like Dido and Turnus, so the obstacles and the enemies of the Trojan mission. And again, the Trojans prefigure the Romans. So because Virgil extends this sympathy as he does, I don't think he was actually giving Augustus any kind of propagandistic piece that Augustus may have wanted. Virgil told Augustus, or at least advertised to his audience in an earlier poem, the Georgics, that he was going to write a grand epic celebrating Augustus. And that's not really what the Aeneid is. I mean, even if you see that Aeneas prefigures Augustus, again, the ways in which Aeneas is a complicated and problematic character in a lot of ways, and again, the ways in which sympathies aren't limited to the Trojans, that makes it something more than this kind of national propaganda piece.
Yeah. Susannah, anything you want to add here on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think Scott has summed it up really beautifully. I would just say that in many ways, this kind of epic of origins at this transitional moment, it has been at many points in the past kind of tempting for readers to interpret it as a propaganda piece in this way. But I think a lot of the richness of the Aeneid, and the reason that it's such a classic and continues to provoke conversation, is that it leaves these multiple readings open. It sort of resists being kind of neatly recruited one way or another for kind of an ideological purpose, because of that sympathy that we've described for the people who are conquered, that voice that looks to the costs, both for the Trojans themselves, but then also for those who oppose them. I think that means that the Aeneid can be read as, an epic that tells a story about, imperial advancement toward the Roman future, but it can also be read as really questioning that in powerful ways and kind of sympathizing instead with the refugee and the displaced and so on. And I think this is really critical because that's such a major part of actually what the enduring relevance of this poem is. I think we'd be much less interested in reading it today if it were, the kind of flat propaganda piece for the Augustan regime that, maybe Augustus would have hoped for, but instead we get this, and it's not that.
That's a good point. Okay, so let me throw a bunch of questions here, and you can get in the weeds. So a few things I want to know. So the first thing is, what was it like translating from Latin to English? That is not. I mean, you guys can tell me, but I mean, I feel like it's not that far away. I mean, you're not translating from, Russian or Arabic or Mandarin or something. It's not that far. So, but I'm curious about what that was like, and how does that, I guess, differ from Homeric Greek, which actually wasn't spoken, to my understanding. It's different than Koine Greek, and obviously different than modern day Greek. And what are these differences between oral and written poetry, which I think is also another interesting question here. Obviously, as I mentioned, the Iliad and the Odyssey were out of the oral tradition and then written down later. It doesn't appear that way for this. This was written from the beginning. And so, what is that piece? And then, yes, you can kind of nerd out a little bit on what you were describing before. So I'll just set it up here. Tell us about the differences between the Iambic and the Dactylic, right? Hexameter, and why you decided to land on Iambic. Now, if again, not to compare, but I had a chat with Daniel Mendelsohn, and he did the Odyssey recently, and he did the opposite, from my understanding. He did the 6-beat, 17-syllable, long dactylic hexameter. I think he was describing it of, one is a bit shorter, one is a little bit longer, but to try and get it, the essence of it. And I mean, you can understand the difference of like how things kind of read, right? Of sort of, something is, boom, 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 as opposed to boom, boom, boom. Like, there's a whole cadence to it of sorts, of my understanding. So you can bring in the blank verse piece here, but why was it to not do line by line? I mean, you were starting to get into it, Scott, but how is it foot by foot and not line by line? Why that was the case, and why are there some of the repetitions that are in the poem as well? So that's a bunch of questions, so feel free to tackle them and in whichever way you want, but I'm very curious about this.
Yeah, so maybe I'll speak a bit to the kind of first piece of that, the experience of translating from Latin into English, and also some of the elements to do with oral versus written poetry. I would say the biggest challenge, and this actually ties into some of the challenges to do with length, the biggest challenge translating from Latin to English is that Latin is an inflected language. And so that means that Latin uses the endings of words to indicate certain grammatical content in ways that English can't fully. So, a given an individual Latin word, viro, could mean to or for the man. It could mean actually by, with, or from the man, sometimes paired with a preposition. But in English, we often require significantly more words to express certain ideas. Latin kind of operates in the form of these kernels of meaning in which the endings can carry really a lot of weight. And so because Latin is an inflected language, that also means that it can do things with word order and the flexibility of its word order, especially in verse, that English can't quite do. That meant that there were certain poetic effects that were really challenging for us to capture. There's one moment in Aeneid 4 when Aeneas and Dido are together inside a cave. They're taking shelter from a storm. This is the moment at which they consummate their relationship. And the Latin places the words eandem speluncam, the same cave, physically around the names of Aeneas and Dido. So like the cave itself actually embraces them on the page, and they're inside it together. That was something, right, that in English, like, we wrestled with, but couldn't quite figure out a way to capture. But there were other places, because Latin and the way in which Virgil constructs his thoughts in Latin often sets significant weight on things like word order. We did, at other moments, for instance, he delays a really important word kind of as long as he can to maintain suspense. So a prime example of this is the moment in Aeneid 2 when serpents are showing up from the sea who will attack the Trojan priest Laocoon, who was opposing bringing the Trojan horse into the city. And Virgil holds off on including the word serpents for kind of as long as he can until the very end of the line. And that is something that we were able to replicate. But I think it required us just at every stage, because Latin can do so much with word order, because it can do so much with sound effects as well, even though this is a literary text. It's written, as you said, rather than being composed orally in the way the Homeric poems were. Virgil's deeply interested in sound and uses features like alliteration and assonance and so on to capture effects really vividly. So it really required us, I would say, to kind of bring to the table every tool that we could in terms of the English poetic arsenal to try to capture and approximate as much of these effects as we possibly could.
It's very nice. Yeah, it's very helpful. Go ahead.
I could speak to the question of iambic pentameter if you'd like.
Yeah, please.
Sure. So Daniel Mendelsohn is absolutely right that of course the iambic pentameter line is shorter than the dactylic hexameter line, and that is a choice that translators have to make because it does depart therefore from the original. And every translator has to determine the degree to which they want to depart from the original, how they want to do so formally. So Fagles, for example, he doesn't have a strict meter, but he has basically a six beat line trying to reproduce the hexameter in that way. People like Fitzgerald and Mandelbaum and Rudin have used iambic pentameter. Right. So there's this long tradition of pentameter in translating the Aeneid. So that was one of the reasons that we chose that particular meter. So the history that the Aeneid has with the English iambic pentameter seemed to us incredibly weighty and meaningful, and we wanted to kind of participate in that history.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but how do you think it would have sounded in the other way? Would it have been, so there's a history and tradition, but would it have been very distinctly different if you had used the other form with the hexameter?
Yes. It certainly would have. So hexameter effectively is the rhythm is dun da da 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 dun dun, right? With some substitutions that are possible, right? Whereas iambic pentameter is the dun da dun da dun da dun da dun, sometimes with a dun at the end. So eternal sunshine of the spotless mind, right, is a pentameter line, right? So it's shorter and it's faster, right? It's a speedier line. And so again, that is something that doesn't directly reproduce the effect of the original.
Sure.
But we think it occupies an equivalent position. So we chose to work in that particular meter.
Yeah.
An equivalent cultural position.
Yeah. And I'll just add also in terms of the length, because the big challenge for the iambic pentameter is that it's a shorter line. So you can have up to basically 17 syllables in a dactylic hexameter line. If you're strict with your iambic pentameter, basically it should be 10 beats plus maybe an extra kind of unstressed syllable at the end of the line, up to 11. That was really the kind of primary challenge that led us to adopt this foot for foot approach. So we had produced actually an initial draft of Aeneid 2 that was iambic pentameter and the same number of lines as the Latin original. And we realized that in producing that draft, we felt that because Virgil's poetry, the individual word is so dense with meaning, he's caring so much about the individual word, that we felt that for us, the cost was just too high. We were kind of losing too much in losing a metrical unit per line. And that was what led us to adopt this approach of saying, all right, if in the as Scott described, if in the transition from dactylic hexameter to iambic pentameter, we're losing 1 metrical foot per line from 6 feet to 5 feet, then let's allow ourselves roughly every 5 lines, another 5 feet. That is another iambic pentameter line to try to capture. We wanted to still place constraints on ourselves and not be sort of unduly permitting ourselves to expand. It's very tempting to do that. We really had to kind of rein ourselves in, but that was kind of our approach for trying to capture as closely as we could the pace of the poem and the briskness of its movement, while also using a meter that does occupy this kind of comparable cultural place. It's much more natural to many readers of English poetry to encounter iambic pentameter lines and to read them in a sustained way. And that was something that we really wanted to kind of capture.
And I'll just say very, very briefly that it was also important for us to work with a strict meter, because all ancient poetry is metrical, so it's the kind of closed form in that way. And we felt the kind of discipline of that would put us in kind of greater sympathy with Virgil as well, trying to grapple with the kind of rules and the constraints that meter imposes.
Is this sort of the blank verse that you guys talk about? It comes into play here. I don't. Maybe I missed it, but is that connected here?
Yes.
Talk about that.
Yeah. So when we say blank verse, what we mean by that essentially is unrhymed iambic pentameter.
Okay.
So iambic pentameter lines, but without end rhyme. There have been translations of the Aeneid that featured end rhyme. We felt that it was important to avoid that for our purposes because it wasn't present in the poetry of antiquity. But the kind of strictness of the metrical verse was an important feature. Yeah. So it's common. I think it's easy for people to mix up blank verse and free verse. Relative to the English tradition, but by blank verse, we do mean iambic pentameter just without rhyme at the end. Yeah.
Nice. Very nice. Now, tell us about a little bit here, a difference in terms of theme. One thing that really came on my radar was I had a great conversation with Shakeshaft, Hugo Shakeshaft. He wrote this fabulous book called Beauty and the Gods, I think is what it is. And he talks about a lot of the relationship between ancient Greeks and other ancient literature between humans and gods, which I thought was interesting. And obviously, you see this a lot in Homer, and you see it in the Aeneid as well. But what is the Aeneid's dynamics? Or what does it tell us about the relationship between gods and humans? That is. What does it say generally? But then, how is it maybe different from other pieces of literature?
So the gods are characters in ancient epic. It's one of the things that kind of elevates ancient epic. The gods participate in the world of epic. It's the boundary between the divine and the mortal is entirely permeable. So that's a fundamental aspect of that particular genre. There are, however, in the poems both divine and human kind of needs and wants. So the gods want things and mortals want things, and sometimes those things align and sometimes they do not. So the gods as participants are sometimes benevolent and sometimes not, right? The gods have a great capacity for anger, for vengeful behavior. So in the Aeneid, the major divine antagonist for the Trojans and Aeneas is the goddess Juno. And at the very beginning of the poem, the narrator asks, "Can gods have so much anger in their hearts?" Speaking about Juno in that context. So this kind of sense of that you have these powers, these divine powers that are, of course, so much greater than mortals, but they're not always there to serve mortals. In fact, they can be there to punish mortals, right? So there is this sense of a universe that is in many ways unfriendly to human beings, and it's one of the things that can make this epic world so kind of terrifying, right? To know that there are these gods arrayed against the mortals. I'll say one quick thing about that. In Book 2, Venus, and this is a nice example, Venus is helping Aeneas because Venus is Aeneas' mother, trying to get him to leave Troy and head off to Italy on his fated mission. To convince him, she removes the veil, the mortal veil from his eyes so that he can see reality as it truly is. And when he does, he sees other gods, Neptune in particular, but Jupiter and Juno, tearing apart the city of Troy, right? It's this terrifying vision, right, of these powerful divinities destroying the city around him, right? Of course, he's entirely impotent there. And he realizes, right, that of course that the city is now falling. There's no escape. He needs to depart. So it's a great example. I mean, I've always found that so chilling, right? That around, we don't see it. We mortals don't see it, but around us, there are these gods, right? Who are operating, working against human interests, and in fact, trying to destroy some segment of the human population.
But I guess I'm with you. The visual of it is very, very gripping. But obviously, gods aren't real. So I'll ask for forgiveness from the gods for saying that. But they're not real. I guess the idea is, though, for Virgil and for other people when they're talking about the gods, and even at the time, maybe some people really did believe that they were real. But the idea, though, is it sort of like taking an abstraction from our human mind and anthropomorphizing it to say, what do we view about war, destruction, jealousy, emotions, human relations? Is it just when somebody reads the gods in these epics, that it's really trying to look at this way of abstracting big ideas in a way of how you can interact with these ideas, personified with characters and things like that? Is that too fine of a point, or what do you either one of you, what do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that kind of interpretation that the gods often serve as these anthropomorphized representations of particular ideas definitely is one way of interpreting them, that they become in many ways kind of characters who represent the attributes associated with them. And in fact, that interpretation dovetails really nicely with the idea that's often known as double motivation, which is the idea that an action can be described as, on the one hand, an act that is a sort of, I would say, I guess, precipitated by divine involvement, but also something that's chosen by a human's free will. That there's sort of something in an individual that leads them to perform a particular action, even as in the world of epic, it's often also being represented as having been prompted by a particular god. The question of kind of to what extent, to what extent belief in the gods would have been widespread is a difficult one. There are different schools of thought. One approach would be, that ancient religion was really concerned with kind of right practice and proper ritual relationship with the gods, and perhaps in some ways kind of more interested in that even than in the question of kind of individual belief. But we also see different characters within the world of the Aeneid relating to the gods in different ways. So for Aeneas, they are characters who interact with him very directly. And sometimes he still struggles to interpret their messages. He doesn't know what to do with them. There's kind of a shadowy quality to many of their instructions and room for misinterpretation. But at the same time, when he expresses in Aeneid 4 to Dido that from his perspective, he's been very directly commanded by the gods that he has to leave Carthage. And he tells Dido, look, Mercury came down and delivered this message to me in broad daylight. I saw it. This was real. Dido's reaction is, among other things, yes, this is what concerns the gods above, sarcastically, right? From her perspective, her own conception of the divine leads her to question whether actually the gods would sort of bother to send Mercury down to tell Aeneas it's time to leave Carthage. So I think part of the power of the representation of the gods in the Aeneid is that it opens up these different interpretations as well. And so we certainly see that kind of, the kind of anthropomorphized attributes, like that kind of interpretation is possible, but then also we see, their actions in really tangible ways too.
And I'll just say too, in antiquity, there were distinctions made between the gods of the state and the gods of ritual, and then the gods of epic, right? These kind of literary gods. So there were certainly these distinctions drawn, but within the world of the epic, within that imagined world, these gods are very, very real, right? And in that way, they can at least stand in for these powerful forces, these powerful, the things, forces of doom and danger and sadness and sickness and death, right? They can at least stand for these things that we humans can't control, right? And that are just a part of our world, and that we have to try our very, very best to negotiate.
Yes, there's like almost like a hierarchy that's developed. That's very fascinating. That's very, very interesting. One theme here I'm curious about is in the Aeneid. Something that popped out to me, and I think you guys mentioned it, is this idea of Virgil is showing us the pain of the human condition, right? The melancholy that many humans can feel in many different ways, which is very arresting for me in reading it and understanding it. How do you feel this comes out in the poem, and what is the essence of what he's trying to say on this theme?
Yeah, I would say for us, we really read this as kind of one of the most significant and enduring themes of the poem. We think of it, I think a line that came to mind for us often as we translated was Tennyson's description of Virgil in the poem that he addresses to Virgil as "thou majestic in thy sadness at the doubtful doom of humankind." And we see a lot of that in the Aeneid. We certainly see that, like, the doubtful doom of humankind is a common theme throughout the poem, but also the kind of majesty of Virgil's sadness, that he gives an epic dignity and an epic weight to these very human struggles. And he does that, again, not just for his protagonist or for the characters who are on the Trojan side, but kind of most of all for the characters who are on the losing side. And I think just this image of, like, the compassion that comes through in that is really, really arresting. He applies that. I mean, certainly Dido, like her voice of sorrow and lamentation and betrayal is so resonant. And, we know that it's something that gripped readers, already in the time of Augustine, that he reports, weeping for Dido as he encountered her story in the Aeneid. But it's also the case that a lot of the moments that should seem like moments of triumph for Aeneas are kind of shot through with melancholy. That victory never really comes in the Aeneid without a sense of sadness and loss and defeat. And even characters who have these sort of bit parts on the battlefield often are portrayed with a sense of kind of sympathy and recognition for the losses that they represent. I'm thinking in particular about one character in Aeneid 10 who makes an incredibly, incredibly brief appearance. And as he dies on the battlefield, Virgil gives him a line that we translate as "remembering sweet Argos as he died, his homeland." So we have a character who appears for this really brief moment and yet still gets this really moving send-off. Yeah. So I think it's really kind of at the very heart of the poem, I would say.
I'll say toward the end of the poem, there are two very, very good examples of that. One is in Book 10. There's this arch villain named Mezentius, who, he appears starting in Book 8. He appears. Starting in Book 7, he appears. And when he appears, he's this tyrant. He's this bloodthirsty tyrant. His people have deposed him. He's just this monstrous kind of character. Toward the end of Book 10, his son dies, and his son dies. Aeneas kills him on the battlefield, and his son dies while defending Mezentius. Right. So when Mezentius, this tyrannical monster, when he hears about this, suddenly he's transformed. Suddenly we discover that he has white hair. Virgil had never given us this detail before. He's injured. He's having a hard time, getting to his feet. He's mourning the death of his son, and he's ultimately killed at the end of Book 10 by Aeneas. But suddenly, this transformation from monster to sympathetic character is really striking. So even a figure like Mezentius, even that character is granted this sympathy, this pity. And then finally, at the very end of the poem, the very controversial and difficult end of the poem, when Aeneas vanquishes his major rival, Turnus, again, you would think this would be a moment of triumph in this epic poem. Things have been kind of, leading to this moment. But Virgil, he focuses on the feelings of Turnus, on the sadness of Turnus and Turnus' sister, right? So Juturna. So it's interesting that we don't see what Aeneas feels as he's about to vanquish Turnus. We see what Turnus really feels until the very, very end of the poem, where Aeneas just erupts into anger and rage, right? But the sympathy, the sense of pity, the sense of loss, right? This is given to Turnus at the end of the poem, which is so striking, right? again, complicating the status of this poem as a national epic, as a celebration of Aeneas, as a celebration of Trojans, and ultimately a celebration of the Romans.
It's almost a type of theory of mind that you're able to focus on how someone else could feel, or what their experience or what their impact is, which is really amazing to understand what we know about social emotions, so to speak, or interactions between humans. It's quite a marvel, actually, to understand and see it that way. And another piece of this, why this kind of is nice, is it speaks to not being afraid or not being kind of sheepish about talking about hard human emotions. It's not just aesthetics and euphoria and all these things, but really, really kind of embracing the darker sides of what human experience is, which those are the pieces of the poem that really kind of resonated with me. It had a kind of groundedness to it, which was really, really, really nice. So, final question. I kind of asked this in the beginning, but after this conversation that we've had, what's the selling point aside from go and get the New English translation out by these two wonderful people of the Aeneid. But aside from that, why should people read this? And why should people continue to read this story and what they can glean from it? What's the takeaway there for 21st century?
Well, I hope that people in the course of our conversation have maybe heard some elements of the story that will jump out to them as kind of resonating and carrying contemporary weight. Really, we've seen our task as translators. Again, we've seen in terms of kind of trying to strike this middle path between accessibility and elevation, and present the epic in a way that readers can really connect with. It's been a story that both of us have lived with and found so much value in kind of continuing to read together. And we also hope that readers will maybe find in it a prompt for conversation with one another, in the same way that we kind of lived in dialogue with each other as we were crafting this translation. I think in kind of the present moment, there's so much about the Aeneid that in the way of kind of a true classic text, it just really is timeless and can continue to connect with people. One element, I think, Aeneas's struggle to kind of balance his own public responsibilities against his own private desires, this challenge of figuring out, to what extent can I live for my own hopes and dreams versus to what extent am I obligated to live for others' hopes and dreams? And the question of kind of obligation to future generations, what we owe the future. I think those are questions that are just as urgent and pressing now in our 21st century moment as they were in the moment when Virgil was writing. And certainly things as well like, in the poem, rumor is often a really powerful driving force behind the plot. And I think in our current era, the kind of rapid spread of information across devices and so on, that's something as well that we can see a lot that continues to resonate, there. But I would say really a central goal in our translation has been trying to capture that emotional weight and power in this poem that has come through, I think, especially in this latter part of our conversation. And that's something that we really hope readers can latch on to as they come to it.
Yeah, I'll just say too, just very, very quickly, I mean, Susannah said it very, very well, but there is, of course, great chronological distance between us and the Aeneid, the cultural distance. But I think in the ways that Susannah has described, the poem can speak to us. I also think for me, it's really a poem too about perseverance. Right, this is what the Trojans really, and Aeneas, they just need to persevere over and over again in the face of really long odds at times, kind of groping through the darkness often. Again, even though their mission is fated, it doesn't appear to be fated to them or to the reader throughout much of the poem. So I think this idea of just kind of putting one foot in front of the other, there is a kind of heroism in that. It's not an especially glamorous heroism. I think Achilles and Hector and Odysseus, they tend to be more glamorous heroes, but there is a kind of everyday heroism to that, right? That I think can appeal to readers at any point, really.
Yeah, I fully agree. There's something about these stories, and I think why we should keep reading them, and it's really nice that people do. And is there's something really spectacular about seeing the human experience and the human condition through time.
Mhm.
That humans in the first century AD or BC, yes, there's differences, but is enough there that what humans at that time and in a different place were feeling or going through is not wildly different from what any of us is going to go through on a certain level, whether that's socially or emotionally or cognitively. And that is, I think there's a connectedness there through time, through culture, through is to get at the human condition, which is pretty spectacular. So, Scott, Susannah, thanks so much for coming on and talking about the Aeneid and talking about your wonderful English translation. It was such a delight to talk to both of you about this, and I hope that you both do more work together, and we can have more conversations as well. So big thanks, and I wish both of you all the best on the copies of the translation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so
Yes.
much.